part eye-opening, the many Coca-Cola mansions of the Candler family. Atlanta has houses that were never meant to be quiet. They are quiet now, not because they were designed to disappear, but because the city learned how to move past them. Brick and stone remain. Trees have grown thicker. Roads widened. Functions changed. The houses stayed, but their authority thinned. Some of them are public now. Some are institutional. Some are still private, but no longer decisive. Together they form a scattered presence across the city, not one estate, but many. Not one declaration of wealth, but a pattern of repetition. This is not accidental. The Candler family did not build a single mansion to anchor their fortune. They built several across different neighborhoods for different branches of the family across multiple decades. Each house carried scale. Each borrowed architectural language associated with permanence. Each attempted in its own way to convert industrial wealth into something that could resemble lineage. What remains today is not a unified legacy, but a map. A map of how modern power tried again and again to make itself feel settled. The name Candler is inseparable from Coca-Cola, a product that achieved dominance not by concentrating itself, but by dispersing. Bottles everywhere, signs everywhere, corners, counters, machines, trucks. Coca-Cola became powerful by being ordinary, by entering daily life until it no longer felt like a choice. The mansions did the opposite. They pulled wealth out of circulation and fixed it in place. They turned liquid capital into immovable form. They stood apart from the street. They introduced distance, physical, visual, symbolic, between those inside and the city around them. This contrast is the first tension of the story. A family whose fortune depended on mass repetition attempted to express that fortune through exclusivity. A product that survived through ubiquity funded houses that relied on separation. The result was not contradiction, but anxiety translated into architecture. The Candlers were not inheriting land held for centuries. They were not extending ancestral estates. Their wealth emerged rapidly from a formula and a system under modern conditions. That kind of wealth behaves differently. It does not trust time. It does not assume continuity. It builds. Asa Griggs Candler, the man who acquired control of Coca-Cola in the late 19th century, moved through multiple grand residences over the course of his life. Callan Castle in Inman Park, later a prominent mansion on Ponce de Leon Avenue in Druid Hills. Even at the level of the founder, there was no single architectural endpoint. This movement matters. When wealth feels secure, it settles. When it feels provisional, it rehearses permanence repeatedly, as if the next structure might finally be enough. The next generation continued this pattern. Charles Howard Candler built what would later become Callan Walday, an imposing Tudor Revival mansion designed to signal stability, hierarchy, and cultural authority. Walter T. Candler built Lullwater, an estate that still reads as private power even after being absorbed into Emory University's institutional life. Asa G. Buddy Candler Jr. developed Briarcliff, an ambitious property that blurred the line between residence, spectacle, and experiment. These were not variations on a single house. They were parallel answers to the same question. How does new money persuade itself that it will last? Architecture has always been one of the preferred answers. Stone slows time. Scale suggests inevitability. Historic styles borrow credibility from eras that survived longer than their builders did. Long drives, gates, elevation, and separation all perform the same function. They make wealth appear settled. But appearance is not endurance. Atlanta changed faster than these houses could anchor it. Neighborhoods expanded, streets became corridors, institutions grew outward and absorbed land that had once been private. The city did not attack the mansions. It surrounded them. Some survived by becoming public. Callan Walday still stands because it stopped being domestic. Its rooms now host exhibitions, events, and visitors who were never meant to cross those thresholds. The house remains, but its purpose inverted. Others survived by becoming institutional. Lullwater persists because it became useful to an organization larger than any single family. Its continuity is administrative, not dynastic. Others fractured. Briarcliff's ambitions exceeded its stability. Its scale and experimental character made it harder to absorb cleanly into a single future. Parts remain. Parts have been altered. Parts exist as memory rather than structure. This uneven survival is not incidental. It reveals something about the nature of the project itself. If one mansion had been sufficient, if one architectural gesture had successfully converted industrial wealth into lasting authority, the family would not have needed so many. Multiplicity signals uncertainty. Repetition signals rehearsal. The Candlers did not build many houses because they could. They built many because one was never enough to resolve the same unease. Each new mansion corrected something the previous one had not fully achieved. Location, style, scale, privacy, visibility. Each attempted to stabilize a fortune that was fundamentally mobile, dependent on distribution, advertising, logistics, and consumer behavior. Stone could not replicate that stability. What these houses attempted was not dominance of the city but insulation from it. They withdrew wealth from the volatility of markets and placed it into landscapes that felt slower, older, more predictable. But cities do not slow down to accommodate architecture. Atlanta continued to grow. Roads arrived, land was subdivided, context shifted. What had once been commanding became contextual. What had once organized space became surrounded by it. Today, the Coca-Cola fortune remains globally present. The houses that once tried to embody that fortune exist in altered states. Some are carefully maintained. Some are partially forgotten. Some remain impressive but no longer authoritative. They have become artifacts rather than anchors. This is not a story about a single mansion rising and falling. It is a story about repetition as strategy, about how wealth, when it does not trust its own future, builds again and again, hoping that permanence might eventually feel real if it is expressed often enough. The many Coca-Cola mansions of the Candler family are not monuments to confidence. They are monuments to reassurance. And reassurance, when multiplied across a city, leaves a different kind of trace, one that does not tell us how powerful a family was, but how carefully that power tried to convince itself that it would endure. That is the landscape we are about to enter. Not one house, but many attempts at permanence scattered across time, architecture, and Atlanta itself. Part 2, From Syrup to Stone. How a mass product tried to become lineage. Asa Griggs Candler did not inherit Coca-Cola. He acquired it. That difference matters more than any architectural detail that followed. Inheritance carries a sense of inevitability. Acquisition carries a sense of contingency. What is inherited feels entitled to remain. What is acquired always carries the memory of how easily it might not have been. Coca-Cola, at the moment the Candlers took control of it, was not destiny. It was an experiment that had worked, a formula that could be reproduced, a brand that could be distributed, a system that depended on repetition, trust, and scale. Its power came from circulation. Syrup moved, bottles moved, signs moved, capital moved. Nothing about Coca-Cola was meant to sit still. This created a problem for those who benefited most from it. Wealth that moves too easily does not feel secure. It grows quickly, but it also feels exposed. Markets shift, tastes change, regulations appear, competitors multiply. What circulates can also evaporate. The Candlers understood this intuitively, even if they never articulated it publicly. And architecture became their answer. Stone does not circulate, land does not move, houses do not evaporate overnight. Architecture promised something Coca-Cola could not, the illusion of permanence. But the transition from syrup to stone was not straightforward. A mass product does not naturally translate into lineage. Lineage requires continuity across generations, not just profit across quarters. It requires symbols that suggest inevitability rather than innovation. The Candlers attempted to manufacture that inevitability spatially. Their mansions were not built as simple residences. They were designed as instruments of conversion tools meant to convert industrial success into something that could resemble aristocratic stability. This is why style mattered so much. Rather than inventing a distinctly modern architectural language, many Candler houses reached backward. Tudor Revival. Classical references. Historicist forms that implied age, tradition, and inherited authority. These styles were not chosen for efficiency or novelty. They were chosen for reassurance. Reassurance for the builders. Reassurance for the city. Reassurance for future generations who would walk these halls and assume continuity. But architecture cannot create lineage on its own. Lineage is temporal. It requires patience, repetition across generations, and acceptance by the surrounding society. It cannot be rushed into existence by money alone. The Candlers attempted to compress time. They built as if they could skip the slow work of cultural embedding and arrive immediately at the appearance of permanence. Multiple houses across multiple branches of the family appeared within a relatively short historical window. This acceleration is revealing. When wealth believes it will last, it builds slowly. When wealth fears volatility, it builds quickly, trying to solidify itself before conditions change. Coca-Cola's success created exactly this tension. The brand expanded rapidly. It entered national consciousness. It generated unprecedented wealth for its owners. But its very modernity, its reliance on advertising, distribution networks, and consumer behavior made its future difficult to predict. Unlike land, brands must be renewed constantly. The Candlers hedged. They hedged with houses. Each mansion functioned as a hedge against uncertainty. If markets faltered, land would remain. If products evolved, estates would still signal status. If brands shifted ownership, houses would still anchor family presence in the city. But this hedging strategy required repetition. One house was not enough to cover all contingencies. Different suns required different statements. Different neighborhoods required different gestures. Different moments required different corrections. The result was a constellation of mansions rather than a single consolidated seat of power. This fragmentation is crucial. Old aristocracies concentrate, new fortunes scatter. The scattering reveals a lack of confidence in any single expression. It suggests that no one building was trusted to carry the entire burden of representation. Each house carried part of the weight. This distributed strategy mirrored Coca-Cola's own expansion. The brand did not rely on one factory or one market. It replicated itself everywhere. The Candlers applied the same logic to domestic architecture even as they attempted to mask it behind historic styles. Distribution disguised as tradition. The irony is difficult to miss. A family enriched by one of the most modern systems of distribution in history attempted to express its success through architectural forms associated with pre-industrial stability. The houses looked backward even as the money flowed forward. This temporal mismatch produced tension. The city sensed it. Atlanta was not a static backdrop. It was growing, industrializing, reorganizing itself around railroads, commerce, and later automobiles. Neighborhoods that once felt remote became accessible. Estates that once stood apart found themselves surrounded. The Candlers' houses were built to dominate their immediate surroundings. Over time, those surroundings changed faster than the houses could adapt. Architecture assumes stability in context. Cities violate that assumption. As Atlanta expanded, the symbolic isolation of the mansions eroded. Gates no longer implied distance. Drives no longer guaranteed separation. The city's logic encroached slowly, then decisively. This encroachment exposed another problem with converting syrup into stone. Stone demands maintenance, land demands attention, houses demand purpose. A brand can shift strategies without physical consequence. A building cannot. Once built, it must either be used, adapted, or abandoned. Each option carries implications for authority. When a mansion ceases to function as a private residence, it loses its original meaning. When it becomes public or institutional, its symbolism reverses. When it is abandoned or subdivided, its authority dissolves. The Candlers' estates experienced all three outcomes. This diversity of afterlives underscores a central truth: architecture cannot stabilize what culture does not continuously support. Coca-Cola remained culturally relevant by reinventing its messaging while preserving its core identity. The mansions could not reinvent themselves so easily. Their forms were fixed. Their meanings were tied to assumptions about class, privacy, and permanence that evolved unevenly. Some houses survived by surrendering exclusivity. Some survived by surrendering privacy. Some did not survive intact at all. None survived unchanged. This does not mean the strategy failed entirely. The houses did succeed in one crucial way: they made the Candler name legible in Atlanta's landscape. Even today, the family's presence is encoded into neighborhoods, institutions, and street names. The architecture left marks that outlasted individual ownership. But legibility is not the same as dominance. Dominance requires continuous assertion. Legibility allows for reinterpretation. The Candlers achieved legibility, not lineage. Their mansions became reference points rather than centers of power. They anchored memory, not authority. They survived as evidence of past influence rather than instruments of present control. This outcome was not unique to the Candlers. It is characteristic of families whose wealth originates in modern industry rather than land. Industrial fortunes rise quickly, but their architectural expressions struggle to stabilize because they are out of sync with the systems that generated the wealth in the first place. Syrup moves. Stone waits. The waiting reveals weakness. Waiting exposes buildings to time, and time has no loyalty to intention. It reshapes context, reassigns function, and alters meaning without consulting original owners. The Candlers' mansions were patient, but patience alone does not guarantee continuity. Without a cultural framework that supports inherited authority, architecture becomes vulnerable to absorption. Absorption is not destruction. It is transformation. And transformation is precisely what happened. As the 20th century progressed, the logic that had justified large private estates weakened. Progressive taxation, changing social norms, urban density, and institutional expansion all pressured private wealth to redistribute itself spatially. The Candlers adapted unevenly. Some properties were absorbed into institutions, which preserved structure at the cost of private lineage. Some were open to the public, which preserved form while reversing function. Some were altered beyond recognition, which preserved land value while erasing symbolic intent. Each adaptation solved a practical problem. None preserved the original aspiration intact. This reveals the ultimate limitation of using architecture to convert modern wealth into aristocratic permanence. Aristocracy requires social consent over time. Architecture can suggest it. It cannot enforce it. The Candlers built many mansions because they were attempting to secure consent preemptively before time had a chance to decide otherwise. Time did not comply. Instead, time redistributed meaning. The houses became educational centers, administrative residences, cultural venues, or historical curiosities. They remained impressive but no longer instructive. They inspired interest, not obedience. This shift marks the end of the attempt to turn syrup into stone. The conversion was partial, the reassurance incomplete. What remains is not failure but exposure. Exposure of how modern power struggles to anchor itself in physical form. Exposure of how repetition reveals anxiety rather than confidence. Exposure of how cities absorb private ambition and convert it into public memory. The Candlers' mansions are still standing in various forms, but they no longer promise what they once did. They no longer promise permanence. They promise survival. And survival is a different ambition entirely. Part 3. Experiments in Stone. How each mansion tested a different theory of power. Callan Castle was never meant to last. It was meant to announce. When Asa Griggs Candler built Callan Castle in Inman Park in the late 19th century, Atlanta was still learning how to interpret wealth. Neighborhoods were not yet fixed in hierarchy. Industrial fortunes were new. The city had not fully decided where power should live. Callan Castle entered that uncertainty as an assertion. Its Romanesque form was heavy, theatrical, almost defensive, thick stone walls, turrets, and a massing that suggested protection rather than openness. It did not attempt subtlety, it attempted presence. This was architecture as declaration. At that moment, Coca-Cola was still consolidating itself. Distribution networks were expanding, but the brand had not yet achieved inevitability. The wealth behind it was real, but not yet stabilized by time. Callan Castle responded to that condition directly. It did not attempt lineage. It attempted dominance. The house announced that its owner had arrived and intended to be seen. It stood within the city rather than above it, asserting authority through visibility rather than distance. This choice reflected an early theory of power, that presence alone could secure status. That theory did not hold. Inman Park changed. Atlanta expanded. The neighborhood that once represented elite modern living shifted in character. Callan Castle did not adapt. Its theatricality became excess. Its defensive posture became awkward. The house did not fail structurally. It failed contextually. This is the first lesson in the Candler sequence: power expressed too loudly ages quickly. Architecture that depends on spectacle becomes vulnerable the moment the surrounding environment evolves. Callan Castle was abandoned by the family not because it was inadequate, but because its theory of power had expired. The next experiment corrected for that. Callan Wolde Fine Arts Center represents a shift from assertion to insulation. Built for Charles Howard Candler, in the planned suburb of Druid Hills, Callan Wolde withdrew from the city rather than confronting it. The neighborhood itself was part of the strategy. Designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, Druid Hills promised order, hierarchy, and permanence through planning rather than display. Here, architecture no longer needed to shout. It could assume. Callan Wolde's Tudor revival style borrowed from English aristocratic language. Its forms implied inheritance, not conquest. Unlike Callan Castle, it did not need to prove wealth existed. It needed to suggest that it had always been there. This was architecture as naturalization. The theory had evolved: power should not look new, it should look settled. Distance from commerce mattered. Distance from industrial noise mattered. The house did not stand within the city's flow. It stood apart from it. This separation worked for a time. Callan Wolde achieved what Callan Castle could not. It embedded the Candler name into a landscape that promised continuity. The house felt inevitable within its context. It did not provoke reaction. But inevitability is fragile. As Atlanta continued to grow, Druid Hills became valuable not because of lineage but because of location. Institutions expanded outward. The same qualities that made the neighborhood stable made it absorbable. Callan Wolde survived by surrendering its privacy. It became a public arts center. This survival strategy reversed the house's original function. What was built to insulate a family now invites the public. Authority transformed into accessibility. Control gave way to curation. The house remains impressive. It is no longer powerful. This transition marks a critical inflection point in the Candler architectural experiment. Architecture could preserve form by sacrificing exclusivity. But exclusivity was the very mechanism through which power had been expressed. What remained was memory. The next experiment pushed further. Lullwater House represents power through absorption. Built for Walter T. Candler, Lullwater was designed as a private estate, but one that anticipated institutional proximity. Its scale was substantial, but restrained. Its location positioned it near Emory University, rather than deep within a purely residential enclave. This placement was strategic. Lullwater did not attempt to dominate landscape or retreat completely from it. It positioned itself adjacent to an institution that promised longevity beyond any one family. The theory here was subtle. Private power could survive by aligning itself with organizational continuity. This was architecture as adjacency. When Lullwater became the residence of Emory's president, the theory proved correct. The house survived intact because it became useful. Its authority shifted from family lineage to institutional role. The building no longer needed to represent private dominance. It represented continuity of administration. This is a quieter form of power. It does not command. It persists. The Candler family had perhaps unintentionally discovered the most durable survival strategy: surrender private symbolism to public structure. But not all experiments were this restrained. Briarcliff Estate represents excess of ambition. Built and developed by Asa G. Buddy Candler Jr. Briarcliff was never just a residence, it was a compound, a site of spectacle. A place where architecture, entertainment, and experimentation blurred together. Briarcliff did not seek quiet authority. It sought fascination. This was a return to visibility, but at a different scale than Callan Castle. Briarcliff attempted to be more than a house. It attempted to be an environment, a destination, a statement of possibility. This theory of power assumed that fascination could substitute for stability. It could not. Briarcliff's scale and eccentricity made it difficult to integrate into any single future. Its ambition exceeded the city's ability or willingness to absorb it cleanly. Parts survived, parts were altered. Parts exist now more as legend than structure. The experiment revealed another limit: power that relies on novelty requires constant renewal. Architecture cannot renew itself indefinitely. Once novelty fades, excess becomes liability. Across these mansions, a pattern emerges. Each house tested a different hypothesis. Callan Castle visibility creates authority. Callan Wolde distance creates legitimacy. Lullwater alignment creates continuity. Briarcliff spectacle creates permanence. None fully succeeded. Some survived by changing function. Some survived by being absorbed. Some survived only partially. What they collectively demonstrate is not architectural failure but conceptual instability. The Candlers were searching for a spatial form that could stabilize a modern fortune. Each attempt corrected the previous one's weakness. But correction is endless when the underlying condition remains unresolved. The underlying condition was this: Coca-Cola's power was systemic, not territorial. It flowed through markets, advertising, and habits. It did not require land to function. Architecture was always supplementary. That is why no single mansion could carry the burden placed upon it. Each one tried to do something architecture cannot do alone, guarantee continuity without cultural consent. The city ultimately decided the fate of these houses, not through rejection but through reinterpretation. Atlanta did not tear them down en masse. It reassigned them. It folded them into new systems. It allowed them to remain, but not as they were intended. This is how modern cities neutralize private power. They do not confront it directly. They absorb it functionally. The Candler mansions became venues, offices, residences for administrators, fragments within larger developments. Their presence remains legible, but their authority does not. They are no longer experiments. They are results. Results of repeated attempts to anchor a liquid fortune in fixed form. Results of architectural theories tested against time, growth, and institutional expansion. Each house answers the same question differently. None answers it definitively. And that unresolved condition carries us forward. Because after experimentation comes recognition not of success, but of limitation. The Candlers built many mansions not because they enjoyed building. They built because they were searching. Searching for a form that could hold power still. The city never stopped moving. Part 4: Architecture as Declaration. How the Candler mansions tried to speak before being spoken over. The Candler mansions were never passive structures. They were designed to speak. Before a visitor entered a room, before a word was exchanged, before any explanation was offered, the buildings had already begun delivering their message. Architecture carried the burden of introduction. It framed authority spatially, visually, and psychologically. This is how power behaves when it does not trust language. Language can be argued with. Architecture must be navigated. Each Candler mansion relied on architecture as a form of declaration, an attempt to state something about who belonged where, who approached from which direction, and how much distance separated the inside from the outside. These were not neutral choices. They were decisions about hierarchy rendered in stone, wood, and landscape. The first declaration was always distance. Distance from the street, distance from ordinary circulation, distance from visibility that felt uncontrolled. Approach mattered. Long drives were not conveniences. They were filters. They slowed arrival. They stretched anticipation. They reminded visitors that access was granted, not assumed. Gates, curves, elevation changes all performed the same function. They broke continuity between public and private space. Breaking continuity creates authority. Authority depends on thresholds. The Candler houses invested heavily in thresholds. Entry points were rarely direct. One did not simply step from street to door. One was guided, redirected, delayed. These delays were not inefficiencies. They were statements. The longer it took to arrive, the more legitimate arrival felt. Once inside, the architecture continued to speak. Rooms were arranged hierarchically. Movement was choreographed. Certain spaces were meant to be passed through, others meant to be lingered in. Ceilings rose where power was meant to be felt. Materials changed where attention was meant to shift. These were not decorative choices. They were instructions. The mansions taught visitors how to behave without telling them what to do, where to pause, where to speak softly, where to look upward, where not to wander. Architecture does not need consent to instruct. This instructional quality was essential to the Candler project. New wealth lacks inherited authority. It must be learned. Architecture provided a curriculum, but instruction only works if it is reinforced. For a time, the city reinforced it. Atlanta's early 20th century growth created conditions favorable to such declarations. Elite neighborhoods were planned with separation in mind. Zoning, landscaping, and infrastructure collaborated to preserve distance. The mansions did not stand alone. They stood within a system that supported them. That system did not last. As Atlanta expanded, the conditions that allowed architecture to declare authority eroded. Streets became conduits rather than boundaries. Cars collapsed distance. Density increased. Institutions grew outward, indifferent to private symbolism. Architecture that depends on distance loses leverage when distance disappears. The Candler mansions were built to speak first. The city learned how to interrupt. One of the most revealing aspects of these houses is how carefully they avoided modern industrial language. Despite being funded by one of the most modern commercial systems of the era, their architecture reached backward. Tudor forms, classical references, medieval suggestions. These styles did not reflect the economic reality that produced them. They contradicted it deliberately. Modern wealth often fears its own temporality. Industrial success feels fragile. Styles associated with pre-industrial stability offer psychological cover. They imply that what stands here has always stood here. The Candler mansions attempted to borrow time. Borrowing time through architecture is a risky strategy. It depends on the surrounding society accepting the illusion. When society changes faster than the illusion can be maintained, The borrowing is exposed. Atlanta did not reject the mansions outright. It contextualized them. Contextualization is a quiet form of disempowerment. A house that once defined its surroundings becomes one feature among many. A facade that once dominated a view becomes part of a streetscape. Authority becomes aesthetic. Aesthetic authority does not command. It decorates. As this shift occurred, the language of the mansions changed without any physical alteration. Their towers no longer suggested watchfulness. Their gates no longer implied control. Their scale no longer commanded deference. The buildings did not shrink. Their meaning did. This reveals a crucial truth about architecture as declaration. Its power is relational. It depends on what surrounds it, what approaches it, and what it excludes. When those relationships change, declarations lose clarity. The Candler houses were not designed to negotiate meaning. They were designed to assert it. Assertion fails when context becomes plural. Plurality introduces alternatives. Alternatives weaken singular authority. The mansions were built as singular statements within controlled environments. Over time, those environments diversified. Schools, hospitals, apartment buildings, roads, and public institutions arrived. Each arrival diluted the clarity of the original message. Architecture does not age in isolation. It ages in conversation with what grows beside it. Another key element of declaration was visibility. Some Candler houses chose prominence. Others chose concealment. Both were strategies. Prominence attempted to normalize authority through constant presence. Concealment attempted to preserve authority by avoiding scrutiny. Neither strategy proved durable. Prominence invited reinterpretation. Concealment invited discovery. Once discovered, concealed authority feels suspect. The city eventually learned how to see these houses differently. What once read as power began to read as artifact. What once read as inevitability began to read as historical preference. This shift was subtle. There was no moment when the city decided to stop listening to what the mansions were saying. Listening simply became optional. Optional authority is no longer authority. Interior spaces reveal the same pattern. The mansions were designed around controlled circulation. One did not wander freely. Movement followed implied routes. These routes reinforced hierarchy: formal rooms versus private rooms, public-facing spaces versus secluded ones. As functions changed, circulation lost clarity. When Callan Wolde became a public arts center, its circulation was repurposed. Visitors moved unpredictably. Spaces designed for hierarchy hosted events that inverted it. The building survived physically, but its original instructional logic dissolved. Instruction without enforcement becomes suggestion. Suggestion does not hold power. Similarly, when Lullwater became an institutional residence, its interior hierarchy shifted. Authority moved from family lineage to organizational role. The architecture adapted because its scale and restraint allowed reinterpretation. Not all houses were so adaptable. Briarcliff's interiors were too idiosyncratic, too tied to spectacle to transition cleanly. Their declarations were too specific. When specificity loses, relevance architecture becomes burdensome. Burden accelerates erasure. The Candler mansions demonstrate that architecture as declaration requires ongoing reinforcement. It must be supported by zoning culture, economics, and narrative. Without reinforcement, declarations decay into style. Style can be admired. It cannot command. This is where the Coca-Cola comparison becomes unavoidable. Coca-Cola maintained power by constantly reinforcing its presence. Advertising evolved, distribution expanded, messaging adapted. The product repeated itself until it felt permanent. The mansions could not repeat. They stood still. Standing still is fatal to declarations. The city moved faster than the houses could speak. What remains today are structures that still carry the vocabulary of authority, but no longer speak it fluently. Their gates still exist, their distances still register, but they are read as choices rather than commands. This shift marks the end of architecture as declaration. The buildings no longer introduce themselves as statements of power. They are introduced by plaques, guides, administrators, or programs. Their authority has been translated into explanation. Explanation is the opposite of declaration. Declaration assumes agreement. Explanation assumes distance. The Candler mansions now exist in explanatory mode. They require context to be understood. Without context, they are simply large old houses in a modern city. This is not failure. It is exposure. Exposure of what architecture can and cannot do for modern power. Architecture can slow time. It can suggest hierarchy. It can create distance. But it cannot freeze meaning. Meaning belongs to cities, not buildings. Cities rewrite architecture constantly without permission. The Candlers attempted to inscribe permanence into Atlanta's fabric through repeated declarations in stone. The city responded by absorbing, reassigning, and normalizing those declarations until they lost urgency. What we see now is the residue of conversation. Buildings that spoke first. A city that answered last. This exchange sets the stage for what follows. Because once declaration fails, power must decide whether to escalate, withdraw, or adapt. The Candlers did all three unevenly across different houses across generations. And it is in that uneven response that the deeper story begins to emerge. Part V: Life Inside Power, how authority was lived, repeated, and quietly eroded. Power does not reside in facades. It resides in routines. The true work of the Candler mansions did not happen at the gates or in the towers. It happened inside every day through repetition. Through who entered which room, who spoke first, who waited, who served, and who remained invisible. Architecture established hierarchy. Daily life enforced it. The interiors of the Candler houses were designed to regulate behavior without confrontation. They did not rely on rules posted on walls. They relied on spatial expectation. The arrangement of rooms implied order. The distance between spaces encoded status. The ease or difficulty of movement determined who belonged where. Belonging was not negotiated. It was rehearsed. Formal rooms were not simply for gathering. They were for display of manners of restraint, of familiarity with unspoken codes. Informal spaces were still structured. Comfort did not mean informality. It meant controlled ease. Nothing about daily life inside these mansions was spontaneous. Spontaneity undermines hierarchy. Meals followed schedule and ritual. Seating arrangements mattered. Conversation followed patterns that reinforced authority without naming it. Silence was as important as speech. Knowing when not to speak was a learned skill. These rituals did not announce power. They normalized it. Normalization is the most durable form of control. When hierarchy feels ordinary, it does not need defense. The Candler mansions attempted to normalize new wealth by embedding it into daily conduct that resembled old-world discipline. This discipline was not harsh. It was precise. Precision creates predictability. Predictability creates stability. Stability allows authority to persist without force. The houses were designed to minimize friction by ensuring everyone understood their place instinctively. Instinct is trained. Training occurred through environment. Children grew up absorbing spatial cues long before they could articulate them. Servants learned routes that avoided visibility. Guests learned where to pause, where to be ushered, where not to linger. No one needed to be corrected publicly. The architecture did the correcting. Servant spaces were essential to this system. They were not afterthoughts. They were carefully planned networks of corridors, stairs, and rooms that allowed labor to exist without being seen. Visibility was controlled. Access was filtered. Control of visibility is control of narrative. By removing labor from sight, the mansions presented authority as effortless. Meals appeared. Rooms were maintained. Comfort existed without visible exertion. This illusion was central to the project. Effortless power feels inevitable. But invisibility creates dependency. The mansions depended on continuous, disciplined labor to sustain their appearance of calm authority. This labor did not benefit from permanence. It was replaceable, transient, and vulnerable to economic shifts. The stability of the house rested on instability elsewhere. This imbalance mattered. As social norms shifted and labor relations changed, the smooth functioning of domestic hierarchy became harder to maintain. Servant culture eroded. Expectations changed. The invisible workforce that sustained the mansions became more visible, if only through absence. Absence disrupts routine. Routine is where power lives. Without routine, hierarchy must assert itself explicitly. Explicit assertion invites resistance. The Candler mansions were not built to assert explicitly. They were built to assume. Assumption failed when conditions changed. Family life inside the mansions also revealed tension. These houses were not neutral containers. They imposed rhythm and expectation on their occupants. Privacy existed, but it was bounded. Individuality was secondary to role. Roles stabilize systems. But roles restrict growth. As generations changed, the roles embedded in the architecture no longer aligned with lived reality. Younger occupants did not necessarily share the assumptions their environments enforced. The houses did not adapt easily to shifting family dynamics. Architecture is slow to renegotiate intimacy. What once felt like order began to feel like constraint. Spaces designed to regulate interaction became burdensome. Rooms that implied formality discouraged use. Distance within the house created isolation rather than authority. Authority requires recognition. Recognition cannot be forced. As internal recognition weakened, the houses relied increasingly on external validation, social standing, reputation, public acknowledgement. But public culture was also shifting. Displays of private grandeur became less persuasive. Excess drew scrutiny rather than admiration. The mansions began to feel heavy. Heaviness is dangerous to power. Heavy systems resist change. They require maintenance of assumptions that no longer hold. The Candler houses were not easily reprogrammed. Their layouts assumed a way of living that was becoming obsolete. Obsolescence does not announce itself. It accumulates quietly. Rooms go unused. Corridors feel unnecessary. Rituals feel artificial. What once reinforced authority now reminds occupants of distance between intention and reality. At this stage, power inside the mansions became performative rather than lived. Routines continued but without conviction. Authority was enacted because the environment demanded it, not because it felt natural. Performance exhausts systems. Eventually, something gives. In some cases, families withdrew. The houses became too large, too formal, too rigid to accommodate modern life. Maintenance costs rose, emotional attachment weakened. The house that once defined family identity became an obligation. Obligation invites exit. Exit does not require failure. It requires mismatch. When families left, the architecture did not collapse. But its internal logic lost relevance. Without occupants committed to its rhythms, the mansions became shells of instruction without students. Instruction without learners is inert. This is where adaptation began. Some houses adapted by inviting new forms of life, public, institutional, administrative. These new uses brought new routines. But those routines did not align with the original hierarchies. Authority was redistributed. Redistribution is not neutral. Public use dissolves private hierarchy. Institutional use replaces family authority with organizational logic. In both cases, the original domestic power structure disappears. The houses survived physically. Their internal power systems did not. This transition reveals a critical limitation. Architecture can encode hierarchy, but it cannot preserve belief in that hierarchy when cultural support erodes. Belief cannot be built. It must be shared. The Candler mansions assumed belief would follow form. For a time it did, but belief is not permanent. It requires renewal, negotiation, and adaptation. Architecture resists negotiation. The daily life inside these houses was once the mechanism through which power reproduced itself quietly. When that life changed, the mechanism broke. What remained was form without function. Form without function invites reinterpretation. Reinterpretation strips authority. Today, when people walk through former Candler mansions as visitors, students, or administrators, they experience space without inheriting its original discipline. They move freely. They speak casually. They occupy rooms without performing hierarchy. The architecture no longer instructs. It accommodates. Accommodation is survival. But accommodation is not power. The life that once sustained authority inside these houses has ended. What persists is a memory of structure, echoes of routines that no longer regulate behavior. This is not tragedy. It is transition. The Candler mansions reveal that power must be lived daily to persist. It cannot be stored indefinitely in walls. When daily life shifts, authority either adapts or dissolves. These houses chose survival over insistence. They let power go quietly. And in doing so, they prepared the ground for the next phase of the story. What happens after domestic authority dissolves, when architecture must find a new reason to exist. Part 5: Fracture and Absorption. When the city learned how to use what power left behind, the decline of domestic authority inside the Candler mansions did not produce a vacuum. Vacuum attracts force. As family life thinned and ritual weakened, the city moved closer, not abruptly, not aggressively, but persistently. The city did not need to conquer these houses. It needed only to become unavoidable. Urban growth is indifferent to intention. Roads do not ask permission. Institutions do not consider lineage. Zoning does not respect memory. These mechanisms operate without malice. Their power lies in continuity. The Candler mansions were built to resist continuity from the outside. They were not built to negotiate with it. This mismatch produced fracture. Fracture did not appear as ruin. It appeared as pressure. Pressure on land value, pressure on maintenance, pressure on relevance, pressure on meaning. Each pressure alone was manageable. Together they became decisive. The first pressure was proximity. What had once been distant became adjacent. Estates that had been separated by landscape found themselves bordered by streets, developments, and campuses. Distance, the primary architectural instrument of authority, collapsed. Collapsed distance alters perception. When a mansion can be seen daily by people who never enter it, its power shifts. Visibility without access once signaled authority. Over time, it signals redundancy. The house becomes a landmark rather than a command. Landmarks do not govern. They orient. The second pressure was scale. Large private houses depend on economies of care that modern domestic life no longer sustains easily. Staffing declined. Expectations changed. The cost of preserving rooms that no longer served lived purpose increased. Scale that once amplified authority began to amplify burden. Burden forces decision. Decision forces compromise. The Candlers did not respond uniformly. Some branches withdrew, some negotiated, some adapted earlier than others. This unevenness fractured the architectural narrative further. There was no single plan for succession because there was no longer a single form of authority to protect. Fragmentation replaced lineage. Fragmentation invites absorption. The third pressure was institutional expansion. Atlanta's institutions, universities, hospitals, cultural organizations expanded with long horizons and stable funding. They needed land, they needed buildings, they needed continuity more than symbolism. The Candler estates offered all three. Institutional logic does not admire architecture. It appropriates it. When institutions absorb private estates, they do not preserve domestic meaning. They preserve utility. Rooms become offices. Halls become galleries. Lawns become managed landscapes. Authority shifts from family to administration. Administration does not perform power. It manages function. This shift is irreversible. Once absorbed, a house can no longer return to private dominance without extraordinary effort. The building becomes part of a system larger than itself. Its future is no longer determined by lineage but by policy. Policy outlasts families. Some Candler mansions were absorbed willingly, others through necessity. In either case, the result was the same: the house survived by surrendering control. Surrender here is not failure. It is adaptation. But adaptation carries consequence. The house loses its original voice. It no longer speaks authority. It speaks usefulness. Usefulness is quieter than power. The fourth pressure was cultural change. Private grandeur ceased to function as unquestioned aspiration. What once inspired admiration increasingly provoked skepticism. Wealth displayed through space attracted scrutiny. Distance looked exclusionary rather than elevated. The mansions did not become offensive. They became outdated. Outdated authority does not collapse. It becomes optional. Optional authority does not organize behavior. As these pressures accumulated, the mansions entered a liminal state, no longer central to family identity, not yet fully neutralized by public function. Existing in between, they were vulnerable to reinterpretation. Reinterpretation is the city's specialty. The city does not destroy symbols it can reuse. It reframes them. A mansion becomes a cultural center. A residence becomes an administrative home. An estate becomes a campus asset. Each reframing strips one layer of original intent. What remains is form. Form without original purpose is flexible. Flexibility enables survival. This process unfolded unevenly but with consistent logic. Houses that could accommodate new functions survived intact. Houses whose layouts resisted reuse fragmented or diminished. The city selected for adaptability, not grandeur. Adaptability is not a value architecture is often designed for. The Candler mansions learned it late. This learning altered their meaning permanently. They ceased to be expressions of private reassurance. They became public or semi-public infrastructure. Their presence stabilized neighborhoods not through authority but through familiarity. Familiarity is a weak form of power. It does not command, it comforts. Comfort does not require obedience. As a result, the mansion's relationship with the city inverted. They no longer stood apart from urban life. They participated in it quietly. Their lawns hosted events, their rooms held meetings, their walls displayed art or administration. The architecture did not resist. It yielded. Yielding preserved structure. Insistence would have destroyed it. This yielding marks the true fracture point. Not when families left, not when servants disappeared, but when the houses stopped trying to mean what they were built to mean. Meaning surrendered first. Form followed. The Coca-Cola fortune itself did not fracture in this way. The brand adapted, it expanded, it refreshed its imagery while maintaining core presence. Its power remained systemic. The houses could not refresh. They could only be reassigned. This asymmetry reveals the fundamental limitation of using architecture to stabilize modern power. Modern power survives through flexibility, repetition, and abstraction. Architecture survives through solidity, specificity, and place. These logics conflict. When conflict emerges, one must give. The Candler mansions gave. They survived by allowing the city to rewrite them. Today, their authority exists only as memory or aesthetic appreciation. Their role in organizing social hierarchy has ended. Their new role is quieter but more stable. Stability without authority is the endpoint of many private estates. The fracture did not destroy the houses. It completed them. Because once absorbed, once reframed, once relieved of the burden of reassurance, the mansions no longer need to prove anything. They no longer compete with the city, they coexist. Coexistence is not power, but it is endurance. This is the moment when architecture stops trying to speak louder than its surroundings and learns how to listen. And listening is what allows it to remain. Part 7: Second Lives. When houses outlive authority, after absorption, nothing dramatic happens. That is the defining feature of a second life. The Candler mansions did not enter decline through spectacle. There were no sudden closures, no public reckonings, no visible collapse of prestige. Instead, the houses remained where they were, while the reasons for their existence quietly dissolved. This is how power ends, when it is not challenged directly. It becomes unnecessary. A mansion built to organize social hierarchy does not announce when it stops doing so. It simply stops being used that way. The rooms remain. The doors still open and close. The walls still contain sound. But the behaviors they once enforced no longer occur. In their second lives, the Candler mansions are not homes. They are containers. Containers for activity, for administration, for culture, for memory. Their interiors no longer discipline daily life, they host it. Hosting is not governance. When Kallenwalde Fine Arts Center became a public arts center, the transition appeared successful because the building was never aggressive. Its authority had always been quiet, implied through distance and proportion rather than command. That restraint allowed it to accept new occupants without physical conflict. But the meaning changed completely. Rooms designed to regulate social rank became spaces for exhibitions and events. Movement through the house lost its choreography. Visitors entered where they pleased, lingered where they wished, and left without obligation. The architecture still framed experience, but it no longer dictated it. Dictation requires submission. Public space does not offer it. The house survived because it did not resist being reinterpreted. Its second life is stable precisely because it no longer insists on anything. The building does not remind visitors that it was once private power. That history is optional knowledge. Optional knowledge weakens authority. Similarly, Lullwater House entered a second life through institutional continuity. It did not become public in the same way. It remained domestic in scale and function, but the family it served changed. The shift from lineage to role is subtle but decisive. A president's residence does not need to assert authority spatially. Authority is conferred administratively. The house no longer needs to persuade anyone of its legitimacy. It only needs to function reliably. Reliability replaces symbolism. This transition preserved the building almost intact. But preservation is not dominance. The house no longer organizes power, it accommodates it temporarily. When leadership changes, the house remains indifferent. Indifference is the signature of second life. The mansion no longer cares who occupies it. Other Candler properties did not transition as cleanly. Briarcliff Estate struggled because its original ambition exceeded adaptability. Briarcliff was not designed merely to host life. It was designed to perform it. Performance ages badly. Once spectacle loses relevance, architecture that depends on it becomes difficult to reuse. Briarcliff fractured not because it was neglected, but because it resisted simplification. Parts survived. Parts were erased. The estate's second life is incomplete. Incomplete survival is still survival, but it is survival without coherence. Across these cases, the pattern is consistent. The more a mansion relied on implicit authority rather than overt control, the easier it was to absorb. The more it depended on spectacle, or rigid hierarchy, the harder it was to translate. Translation is the core challenge of Second Life. A house built to govern must learn how to host. A structure designed to separate must learn how to accept circulation. Thresholds become entrances. Gates become references. Distance becomes inconvenience. The architecture does not argue. It yields. Yielding alters the emotional register of the space. What once felt formal becomes calm. What once felt intimidating becomes atmospheric. The mansion stops instructing and starts supporting. Support is not passive. It is functional. Second Life mansions operate on maintenance rather than meaning. They are evaluated by cost, usability, compliance, and safety. Their value is no longer symbolic. It is logistical. Logistics do not care about lineage. This is where memory enters. Memory replaces authority as the primary reason these buildings are valued. Plaques appear, tours explain, archives document. The houses are no longer expected to prove anything through presence alone. They must be narrated. Narration is a sign of distance. When power is active, it does not require explanation. When power ends, explanation fills the gap. The Candler mansions now exist in explanatory mode. Their histories are told rather than felt. Feeling once sustained authority. Explanation sustains interest. Interest is weaker. The house's second lives depend on continued relevance not as centers of power but as sites of memory, culture, or utility. This relevance is conditional. It must be renewed through programming, administration, or preservation efforts. Conditional relevance is fragile, but it is also manageable. Unlike private dominance, which demands constant reinforcement of hierarchy, Second Life demands only maintenance. Maintenance is achievable. Maintenance does not provoke resistance. Resistance would require a claim. The mansions no longer claim anything. This absence of claim allows them to coexist with the city peacefully. They are no longer obstacles to development or symbols of exclusion. They are features sometimes celebrated, sometimes overlooked, rarely contested. Contest marks living power. Absence of contest marks completion. In their second lives, the Candler mansions illustrate a broader truth about modern wealth and architecture. Power that cannot adapt must withdraw to survive. Withdrawal does not mean disappearance. It means reduction of ambition. Ambition is expensive. Second Life is economical. The buildings consume fewer resources when they no longer need to perform authority. They accept change incrementally. They tolerate reinterpretation. They no longer compete with surrounding growth. Competition destroys architecture faster than neglect. The Candler mansions avoided destruction by stepping out of competition. This step was not intentional. It emerged from circumstance, but it was decisive. Today the houses are stable because they are modest in expectation. They do not demand reverence. They do not insist on legacy. They accept being useful, interesting, or simply present. Presence without pressure is survivable. This is what Second Life looks like when it works. Not revival, not redemption, not triumph. Just continued existence without argument. And that continued existence prepares the ground for the final shift, when memory itself begins to thin, and what remains is no longer story or authority, but structure alone. That is where the narrative moves next. Part 8: Memory. Without authority. When power becomes background, memory does not preserve power. It replaces it. This distinction matters because many of the Candler mansions are often described as remembered, historic, or important. These words suggest endurance. What they describe instead is displacement. Authority has not survived inside these buildings. It has been translated into narrative. Narrative is softer than power. Power organizes behavior. Narrative organizes attention. The shift from one to the other marks the final neutralization of private dominance. When a mansion enters its memorial phase, it no longer instructs. It is explained, docents speak, plaques contextualize, websites summarize. The building's meaning is no longer experienced directly through movement, distance, or threshold. It is mediated. Mediation flattens hierarchy. A visitor walking through a former Candler mansion today does not feel compelled to behave in a particular way because of who once lived there. They behave according to contemporary norms, casual, mobile, distracted. The architecture frames their movement, but it does not regulate it. Regulation requires belief. Belief has thinned. This thinning does not happen suddenly. It occurs through repetition without consequence. The first time a house is open to the public, its authority is challenged. The 1,000th time authority is no longer part of the equation. Repetition erodes symbolism. Coca-Cola's repetition strengthened power. The mansion's repetition diluted it. This inversion reveals something fundamental about memory. Memory can preserve form while emptying it of force. It allows buildings to remain visible while becoming inert. Inert architecture does not offend. It does not inspire either. It becomes background. Background architecture performs a crucial function in cities. It absorbs attention without demanding it. It stabilizes streetscapes. It provides continuity without instruction. The Candler mansions, now scattered across Atlanta, operate in this mode. They are no longer destinations of authority. They are anchors of familiarity. Familiarity is not power. Familiarity does not organize hierarchy. It does not command obedience. It does not structure aspiration. It simply exists. This existence is what allows these houses to persist without conflict. Conflict would require stakes. Stakes would require a claim. The mansions no longer claim anything. They do not claim lineage. They do not claim superiority. They do not claim distance. Distance has collapsed into proximity. What once separated private wealth from public life has been absorbed by roads, campuses, neighborhoods, and daily circulation. The houses are now encountered incidentally. Incidental encounter neutralizes authority. When power is encountered accidentally, it loses ritual. Without ritual, authority cannot renew itself. Ritual requires preparation, anticipation, and controlled access. The Candler mansions no longer control access. Even those that remain institutionally restricted are conceptually open. Their images circulate freely. Their histories are searchable. Their interiors are documented. Mystery has dissolved. Mystery sustains hierarchy. Transparency dissolves it. This transparency is not malicious. It is procedural. Modern cities produce information continuously. Buildings are photographed, cataloged, and contextualized. Once contextualized, they are no longer self-evident. Self-evidence is how architecture once communicated authority. Without it, buildings become objects of interpretation rather than sources of instruction. Interpretation disperses meaning. Dispersed meaning cannot command. The second life of the Candler mansions prepared them for this condition. By yielding to public or institutional use, they accepted explanation. Explanation invited memory. Memory replaced power. This replacement is stable. It allows buildings to survive without insisting on relevance. They no longer need to justify their size, their expense, or their separation. They are historical facts rather than social propositions. Facts do not argue. This is why the mansions are no longer controversial in the way private estates often are. They are not seen as symbols of exclusion or dominance. They are seen as remnants, interesting, sometimes beautiful, sometimes inconvenient, but rarely threatening. Threat is necessary for power. Without threat, authority dissipates. The memory of the Candler family persists, but it does not organize contemporary life. The name exists in archives, street names, institutional histories. It does not regulate access or behavior. The Coca-Cola brand, by contrast, still does. This divergence underscores the limits of architectural memory. Buildings can preserve names without preserving influence. They can hold form without holding force. Force requires active systems. Architecture is passive. This passivity is not weakness. It is constraint. Buildings do not choose how they are remembered. They are remembered according to contemporary needs. When those needs shift, memory shifts with them. In Atlanta's current urban logic, the Candler mansions serve as texture rather than structure. They add depth to the city's visual and historical field, but they do not define it. Definition belongs to infrastructure, capital flows, zoning, and institutions. The mansions have none of these roles anymore. They have been neutralized by being absorbed into the ordinary. Ordinariness is the final stage of architectural afterlife. It is tempting to read this as loss. It is not. Loss implies something was taken. What happened instead was completion. The houses completed their transition from instruments of reassurance to elements of context. They no longer need to persuade anyone of anything. Persuasion is exhausting. Context is restful. This rest is what allows memory to persist without strain. The mansions are no longer evaluated against ideals of grandeur or legacy. They are evaluated against standards of maintenance, accessibility, and compatibility. Compatibility is achievable. Legacy is not. Legacy demands belief across generations. Belief erodes. Compatibility adapts. The Candler mansions adapted by becoming compatible with indifference. Indifference is not hostility. It is equilibrium. In equilibrium, buildings last. They are neither loved nor hated intensely. They are simply present. Presence without pressure is the most durable condition architecture can achieve in a modern city. This condition also alters how history is taught. When a mansion is no longer powerful, it can be discussed analytically. Its contradictions can be examined without defensiveness. Its ambitions can be understood without reverence. Analysis replaces awe. Awe once sustained authority. Analysis sustains understanding. The Candler mansions now belong to analysis. They are case studies in how modern wealth attempted to stabilize itself spatially, and how cities absorbed that attempt without confrontation. They demonstrate that private power does not need to be defeated to end. It only needs to be made unnecessary. Unnecessary power fades quietly. The buildings remain as witnesses to this process. They do not testify loudly. They do not accuse. They do not defend. They simply exist in altered roles, bearing the marks of adaptation. Those marks are subtle, widened entrances, repurposed rooms, changed circulation, altered landscapes. Each change reduced specificity. Reduced specificity increased survivability. Specificity binds architecture to a moment. Survivability requires looseness. The Candler mansions loosened gradually, not by choice but by pressure. That pressure came from the city's need to function, expand, and reorganize itself continuously. Cities are not sentimental. They remember only what is useful. The usefulness of these mansions now lies in their ability to host support or simply stand without obstructing. They no longer need to explain why they exist. They exist because they can. This is the quiet endpoint of architectural power. Not ruin. Not demolition. Not restoration. Normalization. Once normalized, power does not return. It is replaced by maintenance policy and routine. Routine does not care about lineage. Routine is the city's true authority. The Candler mansions now live under that authority, and that is why they remain. Part 9: What remains: landform and the quiet residue of wealth. When authority withdraws completely, it does not leave emptiness. It leaves residue. The Candler mansions no longer function as power. They no longer instruct behavior, organize hierarchy, or command deference. What remains is not influence in motion, but influence settled, flattened into landform and habit. Residue is difficult to interpret because it does not act. It persists. Land is the first thing that remains. Regardless of function or ownership, the land beneath these houses continues to shape the city subtly. Parcels once consolidated under private wealth remain unusually large. Green space interrupts density. Streets curve where they might otherwise run straight. Campuses and neighborhoods organize themselves around inherited boundaries. This spatial imprint outlasts authority. Even when buildings are repurposed or altered, land remembers its original allocation. The Candler estates did not disappear into the city evenly. They created pockets of difference areas, where scale, greenery, and distance feel slightly out of sync with surrounding development. These pockets do not dominate. They interrupt. Interruption is not power, but it influences experience. It slows movement. It introduces contrast. It reminds the city that its present form is layered over older decisions. Those decisions no longer belong to a family. They belong to geography. Form is the second thing that remains. Architecture, even when stripped of meaning, continues to regulate movement unconsciously. People still enter through certain doors. They still gravitate toward certain rooms. They still feel when spaces are formal or intimate, even if they no longer know why. This regulation is weak, but it is persistent. The Candler mansions no longer organize social life intentionally, but they still organize it incidentally. Events cluster in large rooms. Administration settles into former private spaces. Silence persists where it was once required. These patterns are not enforced. They are inherited. Inheritance here does not imply lineage. It implies continuity without consent. People behave in ways shaped by architecture they did not design and no longer fully understand. This is residue at work. Habit is the third thing that remains. Not habits of authority, but habits of use. Buildings that have been repurposed accumulate new routines layered over old ones. Over time, the original logic fades, but the building's capacity to shape behavior quietly persists. This shaping is subtle. It does not tell people who they are. It tells them where to stand, where to pause, where to move. Movement is easier to govern than identity. The Candler mansions in their current state govern nothing beyond movement and maintenance. That is their final scope of influence. Maintenance itself becomes a form of meaning. When a building is no longer powerful, the decision to maintain it must be justified differently. Preservation becomes practical rather than symbolic. Budgets replace reverence. Compliance replaces ceremony. This shift matters. It means the buildings are evaluated continuously, not mythologized. They survive not because they represent something essential, but because they remain functional enough to justify care. Care is conditional. Conditional care is fragile but honest. The mansions exist now in a state of negotiated relevance. They must align with contemporary needs, cultural, administrative, educational, or logistical to remain. Their past does not guarantee their future. Guarantee has ended. What also remains is absence. The absence of a single, unified Candler presence. There is no central estate that still anchors the family's authority. There is no physical locus of lineage. The mansions are scattered, differentiated, and detached from one another. Scattering dissolves dynasty. Dynasty requires concentration. The Candlers did not leave behind a seat of power. They left behind fragments of a strategy. Each fragment tells a slightly different story, but none can claim primacy. This fragmentation mirrors the fate of many modern fortunes. Wealth generated through systems disperses when those systems mature. Its architectural expressions cannot consolidate because consolidation was never the logic of its creation. Coca-Cola survived by dispersing. The mansions survive by being dispersed by the city. This inversion completes the narrative. What remains finally is a lesson without instruction. Not a warning, not a celebration, not a prescription. Just evidence. Evidence that architecture can slow time but not stop it. Evidence that repetition reveals insecurity as much as confidence. Evidence that cities absorb private power without confrontation simply by continuing to function. The Candler mansions show us that permanence is not achieved by building bigger, older-looking, or more numerous structures. It is achieved by alignment with forces that outlast individual intent. The family aligned with commerce successfully. They did not fully align with urban time. Urban time is indifferent to reassurance. It rewards adaptability. The mansions adapted by relinquishing authority. That relinquishment allowed them to persist as form rather than function, as background rather than command. This persistence is not insignificant. Cities need background. They need structures that do not demand attention but provide continuity. They need places that hold memory lightly without insisting on relevance. The Candler mansions now serve that role. They are not central. They are stable. Stability without power is the final condition of many grand houses. It is not tragic. It is ordinary. And ordinariness, in a city that constantly replaces itself, is a kind of survival. What remains of the Candler architectural project is not dominance but texture. Not authority but interruption. Not lineage but residue. Residue does not argue. It endures quietly until the city decides otherwise. That decision has not yet come. And as long as it does not, the mansions remain no longer as answers to insecurity, but as reminders that even the most carefully constructed assurances eventually give way to time. Part X, the quiet ending, when nothing needs to prove itself anymore. Nothing collapses. That is the final surprise. The story of the Candler mansions does not end with ruin, scandal, or erasure. There is no decisive moment when power is taken away, no symbolic fall that marks an end. The houses remain, the land remains. The city continues around them. What ends is insistence. Insistence is expensive. It requires belief, repetition, and defense. The Candler mansions were built during a moment when belief still seemed possible, when architecture could plausibly stand in for continuity, when size could substitute for time, and when repetition felt like reinforcement rather than doubt. That moment passed quietly. The city did not need to reject the houses. It only needed to stop responding to them. Without response, authority thins. Without resistance, power loses urgency. The mansions did not lose their walls, their roofs, or their material presence. They lost their necessity. Once necessity disappears, architecture enters a different register. It no longer organizes life. It no longer explains status. It no longer demands interpretation. It simply occupies space according to contemporary rules, maintenance schedules, zoning requirements, institutional calendars, budget cycles. These rules are not symbolic. They are procedural. Procedure is how cities outlast families. The Candlers attempted to secure permanence through multiplication, many houses, many gestures, many attempts to stabilize a modern fortune spatially. What remains suggests that permanence was never the correct problem to solve. Cities do not reward permanence. They reward compatibility. The mansions that survived are those that learned how to be compatible with institutions, with public use, with administrative logic, with indifference. Compatibility does not feel like success in the moment. It feels like concession. But concession is how structures endure. The Coca-Cola brand learned this early. It adapted continuously, allowing its form to change while its presence remained. The mansions could not change form easily. They adapted by relinquishing function. This asymmetry explains why the brand persists as power, while the houses persist as context. Context is quieter. Context does not compete. The Candler mansions now exist as part of Atlanta's background infrastructure. They frame neighborhoods, host activities, and anchor memory lightly. They no longer claim ownership over the city's imagination. The city has moved on without needing to erase them. This outcome is not failure. It is resolution. Resolution without drama is the rarest kind. The houses no longer attempt to look older than the system that produced them. They no longer pretend to be something other than what they are, structures built during a brief alignment of capital confidence and ambition. That alignment does not need to be judged. It only needs to be recognized as temporary. Time does not punish architecture for being temporary. It punishes it for refusing to accept temporariness. The Candler mansions accepted it eventually. They stopped trying to hold power still. They allowed themselves to be repurposed, contextualized, and normalized. In doing so, they ensured their own survival not as monuments but as usable space. Usable space is the city's preferred outcome. At the end of this story, there is no instruction to draw from, no lesson to apply directly. The houses do not warn future builders. They do not instruct new fortunes. They simply demonstrate a condition. That condition is this. Architecture can slow time, but it cannot replace it. It can suggest continuity, but it cannot manufacture belief. It can hold form, but not authority. Authority must be lived, renewed, and accepted continuously. When it is not, it fades without conflict. The many Coca-Cola mansions of the Candler family remain scattered across Atlanta, not as a unified legacy, not as a dynasty carved in stone, but as evidence of how power once tried to reassure itself spatially. That reassurance is no longer needed. The city has found other ways to function. And because the city no longer needs these houses to explain anything, they are free to remain. Quietly, without argument, without conclusion. This is where the story ends, not because the houses disappear, but because nothing more is required of them. They stand, and standing without insistence is enough.